The next thing that we use is treating physicians. Okay, and here's where I'm going to stop and talk a little bit about this, because this is where I think we need the most explanation. Okay, the Department of Labor would tend to prefer working with treating physicians when we're dealing with causation, because the treating physician actually knows the patient, is meeting the patient, and is evaluating the patient when you're talking about a living employee. Okay, they're the best source of information about what is going on with that particular patient. Okay, where we have a lot of problems is right here, where you're talking about a rationalized written opinion. All right, you'll have a physician who'll come in and say, you know, I evaluated patient X here. He's worked at Hanford for 20 years. He is a heavy smoker. He worked in a particular job category that had a lot of cement dust exposure. So yeah, you know, maybe his COPD could be linked to, you know, but I'm not totally sure. His smoking probably was a big factor. You know, these equivocating kind of statements, okay? As soon as you get into a situation where the doctor does not provide any rationalization for his or her opinion, you're going to look at, the CE is going to look at that and say, remember, you're convincing me as the claims examiner that what you're claiming is true. Okay? If your physician isn't helping your cause, what happens is we'll try to go back to the treating physician and say, this is our standard and this is what we need you to do. If that doctor does not come back and give us that information, we're going to go to one of our DMCs. And the DMCs are generally a group of physicians who have occupational medicine backgrounds. They're going to look at the causation question and answer it. Okay? So for those folks that are using physicians out there in a consulting basis, the most important piece of information you can take away from this meeting today is making sure the doctor puts down on paper his or her rationale in support of this claim. Okay? So if this doctor, for the example I was just using for the Hanford COPD guy, you know, well, I have a good amount of knowledge about the particulate. This guy clearly had exposure to cement dust because he was, you know, a construction worker. He worked there for 20 years. We know, based on documentation I've received from the site exposure matrices that the advocate gave me, that cement dust is a contributing factor to COPD. Well, I think that the smoking certainly could have been a factor in the onset of this illness. I have no doubt that the cement dust exposure contributed to the onset of COPD. Bing, bang, done. Claim accepted. Okay. If the doctor doesn't offer that or just offers up a general statement of causation and some of these very, you know, that's an easy example. What I'm talking about is a hard case where you've got an individual with some unique autoimmune disease. And the doctor just says, yeah, he's got some very odd, strange disease. It's linked to his employment because of all his toxic substance exposures. That is not going to cut it. Because you've not convinced me that that doctor has any basis to be saying that. It's very important for there to be a rationalized opinion. You understand? Yeah. Okay? I think the same is true here for our contract physicians. The contract physicians have got to do the same thing. Okay? And that's an issue that we look at when we do our evaluations every year for account reviews. Our claims examiners just can't take the CMC and say, oh, whatever the CMC says is what we're going to go with. The doctors have also got to rationalize their opinion on this end as well. Okay? It's important that you understand our claims examiners are merely looking at paper. You make the case in paper. You have to write it down. The doctor has to write it down. You have to make your arguments in writing. They're going to be looking at all the evidence in the case file and making an informed judgment about whether you have convincingly made the argument to support the claim you're making. Okay? That's why I underlined written. Did everybody notice that?
I just want to make a real quick point here. The reason that we have both this site exposure matrix and these contract medical consultants is because without them, we would be relying on only the claimant's information. We'd be relying on just information that the claimant has about exposures. We'd be relying on just information that the claimants can get from the doctor. And oftentimes that wouldn't be enough. We'd be denying a lot more cases if we didn't have the site and if we didn't have these CMCs. Those CMCs are not out there to tell us no. They're out there to give us an opinion that we can't get otherwise. And it's not that we don't have any say in what these doctors say. We tell them what our criteria is. They go and look at the case. They look at all the documentation, and they try to help us make the case for people. So that's why we do these things. And without them, it would be a lot harder for us to accept these cases because of the medical, the criteria we need to have in order to make a case. So without it, the claimants, you guys, would be going seeking exposure information and medical opinions that you might not be able to find. So I just want to make that help you to understand that that's why we're doing this. We don't go out there to create these things to deny cases. We're doing it so that we can accept cases that would otherwise be denied. So.
Could you send the criteria with the SOAP every single time so that when the CMC gets the SOAP, they really understand it? Because even though they've been trained or they have read the DMC manual, they are not going by the criteria of the program. And
Well,
so that
we
would
give
help.
them the SOAP every time, and we
But I
ask
mean
them
with the
questions
criteria.
every time. They have the DMC handbook. We're also doing audits of them. They're new, and we're working with them. So it is a new process for them, and we have like spot checks of their reports, and we're trying to work with the district directors and the district offices to evaluate these reports for that exact issue, for the quality. And as John said, we try not to take every report on its face. We try to evaluate them to see if they're meeting of the criteria. And oftentimes, you'll be surprised how many times the claims examiners go back to them and say, I need more information from you.
Right.
So if they would have sent the criteria at first, maybe they would have been
Well-
able to.
Well, they do send us criteria, and it depends on the
Well,
case.
I think the answer to that question is the CMCs, we used to call them DMCs, now we call them CMCs. The CMCs are trained and have been advised as to what the standards are, okay? When we evaluate their responses, we're looking at their written narrative to make sure that that narrative is reflective of an answer that addresses causation in the manner that we would need it to be addressed. Okay? So that doctor has offered a rationale, they have identified scientific literature that backs them up, it makes sense. And we're oftentimes looking at cases where it's spectacularly vague what's going on, and the doctors have got to call all this information, this limited information, and make a judgment on diagnosis, causation, or impairment, or whatever it is, based on limited data. Okay? And so what we have to do is say, okay, well, given what you have, does this make sense? Okay? We could send the criteria, but then, okay, so what does that do? Okay, because what happens when the reports come in? Does that mean that we supplied that to you, so every report we get back, we don't even have to evaluate because you knew what the criteria were?
No, but it would be efficient.
Well, you say that, but I would argue that if you're looking at the report from the DMC or the CMC and say, I don't think that he or she applied the criteria correctly, you then have to argue that point when you're challenging that case.
I'm not worried about me, I'm worried about the 80-year-old
No, I know.
who doesn't know the
I know, and I understand that and appreciate that. So,
what about a case in which several treating physicians make a diagnosis, and then a CMC that has never seen it reverses those treating physicians' diagnosis?
then it becomes a question of the weight of medical evidence. And I heard this come up earlier where people were asking about how can we accept one physician's opinion over another's. Okay? We do what we call the evaluation of weight of medical evidence. Okay? What we're going to look at when we evaluate two conflicting opinions, we're going to say, okay, let's take a holistic evaluation of the reports and decide whose has the most weight or who has the most probative value. We're going to say, okay, the first doctor is an internist. The second doctor is a pulmonologist. The first doctor has done a physical examination. The second doctor has not. The first doctor offered up a generalized, equivocal opinion that is not supported by any kind of scientific data. This other doctor over here has provided a very lengthy explanation as to why he or she feels this way because of this evidence and offers up a rationalized opinion in support of their position or conclusion. Probative value will probably rest with the second physician. It gets more complicated where we have multiple physicians offering up multiple opinions. We now have a process in place where we actually will now conduct a second opinion evaluation. We'll actually refer that patient out for a physician to actually examine, evaluate the paper evidence, and offer an opinion. Hopefully that second opinion, and it's an independent process where it's basically the same referral process we make for CMCs, except that now that doctor is going to actually be conducting a physical examination of the patient. Hopefully then that results in a resolution of the issue. We then also have a referee process where if there's a dispute between the treating physician, the second opinion, then a referee is going to come in there and make the ultimate decision. Once that referee makes that call, the case is done because the referee is granted special probative value in the opinion that he or she presents.